You grow up thinking debt is simple. You borrow, you pay back. If you don't, something breaks. That's how it works with your credit card, your mortgage, your student loans. So it feels intuitive to believe the same logic scales up to nations. Countries borrow, countries pay, or they don't. End of story. Except that's not how the world you live in actually works. Right now, almost every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes over $38 trillion, the highest figure in its history. The European Union carries around 14 trillion. Japan sits near 9 trillion. Even oil-rich states like Saudi Arabia and export giants like Germany and China are buried in enormous obligations. If everyone owes, the question that should bother you is simple. Owed to whom? This is the part nobody explains when they flash the red debt clock on TV. Because once you follow the chain long enough, you discover something uncomfortable. The world, in aggregate, doesn't owe money to some mysterious outside entity. It largely owes money to itself. But that doesn't mean everyone shares the burden equally. The costs and benefits are distributed with surgical precision. To see how you ended up in a world balanced on $315 trillion of total debt, almost 3 times the size of the entire global economy, you have to rewind to a time before credit cards, before digital transfers, before you could tap your phone to pay for coffee. The origin story of national debt didn't start on Wall Street. It started on a battlefield. The year is 1694. England is at war with France and running out of gold. The king doesn't have enough metal to keep paying soldiers and suppliers. Default means defeat. So he does something radical for his era. He turns to wealthy merchants and asks them to fund the war in exchange for something new. An ongoing stream of interest payments backed not by gold in a chest, but by future taxes. To manage this permanent arrangement between state and creditors, the Bank of England is created, not just as a vault, but as an institutional memory of the deal. For the first time, a state can spend money it doesn't yet have, in size and in peacetime as well as war. In exchange, lenders receive something priceless, a promise from the government, standardized, documented, and transferable. That promise is the ancestor of the modern government bond. France copies the idea. The Dutch refine it. The young United States adopts it to finance its revolution and later its expansion westward. Slowly, something flips. A high national debt stops being just a sign of danger. It becomes a mark of credibility. If investors are willing to lend you money for decades at a low interest rate, it means they believe you will survive long enough to pay them, or at least keep rolling the promises forward. Empires used to conquer territory to extract gold and silver. Now they issue bonds to extract interest. The battlefield becomes the balance sheet. The sharpest weapon isn't the cannon, it's the coupon. Fast forward 3 centuries, and you live in a world where debt is not a temporary emergency tool. It is the underlying architecture of everything. Every war, every crisis, every boom, every bailout sits on invisible scaffolding made of IOUs. But the structure is more circular than you think. Take the United States. Out of that roughly $38 trillion of federal debt, about half is held by investors outside the government, banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, individuals. The rest is owed internally to other arms of the state, like Social Security and various trust funds. Of the portion that's publicly held, about 2/3 is owned by Americans themselves, domestic financial institutions, households, and the Federal Reserve. The remaining third, around $9 trillion, is held abroad by Japan, China, the UK, European financial centers, and a web of other countries. So when people say America is in debt to China, there's a narrow truth to it, but it hides the bigger reality. China holds hundreds of billions in US treasuries, but that's only a sliver of the whole. Most of the debt the US owes is to itself. Here's how the loop works. The Treasury issues bonds to finance spending. Banks, funds, and foreign governments buy them, treating them as safe assets. The Federal Reserve can then step in and buy those bonds from the market, creating new dollars along the way. U.S. taxpayers fund interest payments through their taxes. Those interest payments flow back into retirement accounts, bank balance sheets, and the Fed's own income statement. The system looks linear on a chart. In reality, it's a hall of mirrors. The liability of one institution is the asset of another. The IOU never dies, it just changes hands. And this circularity is not just an American quirk, it's the logic of the entire planet. Japan lends to the US by buying treasuries. The US helps fund Europe and the developing world through institutions like the IMF and World Bank. European banks lend to emerging markets. Emerging markets, in turn, park their dollar savings back into US and European debt. Everywhere you look, you see one country holding another's bonds, one institution holding another's liabilities. It is a global game of hot potato where the potato is made of promises and nobody ever actually drops it on purpose. Underneath all of that sits a fourth layer, the markets themselves. Not the market as an abstract god, but a web of intensely real institutions, hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance giants, high-frequency traders, and above them all, central banks. These entities manage tens of trillions in assets. They decide, in practice, which governments can borrow cheaply and which must pay a painful premium. When those players lose confidence in a country, its currency can collapse, its interest costs can skyrocket, and its political leaders can find themselves negotiating with IMF officials instead of voters. Democracy decides who governs. Markets decide who survives. And sitting at the center of this is the modern high priesthood of money, central banks. They don't simply manage debt, they manufacture it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys government bonds, they create new money in exchange. On their balance sheet, the bond becomes an asset. On the government's balance sheet, the very same bond is a liability. On yours, the new money becomes the medium you work, save, and spend in. Every coin, every bill, every digital dollar in your account is tied, somewhere in the background, to a chain of debt. There is no such thing as debt-free money at scale. That, as the world you were living in before the story even gets to its most uncomfortable part. Because this system was not built on the idea that the debt will one day be paid off. It was built on the assumption that it will be rolled forever. When you borrow for a house, there's an end point, 30 years, 40 years. At some point, the bank expects to see the principal back. If you told your lender, I will never repay this, I'll just keep refinancing until I die, they would call it what it is, a risk. Sovereign debt plays by a different rule book. Governments do not behave like households. They are not expected to eliminate their debt. They are expected to keep it sustainable, to roll it, to refinance it, to make the interest payments on time, to never let the illusion of control crack. When a bond matures, the government issues new bonds to pay off the old ones. The principal is replaced by new principal. The chain extends. Economists call this refinancing. You might think of it as a permanent subscription to the future. In that model, interest becomes the real product. It's the rent the world pays for stability. For investors, government bonds are not scary obligations. They're prized assets. For pension funds and insurance companies, they are the bedrock of portfolios. For banks, they are the collateral that secures loans and underpins liquidity. For central banks, they are nearly indistinguishable from money itself. That is why the idea of paying off all the debt is not just politically unrealistic, it's systemically dangerous. If, somehow, the US decided to eliminate every last dollar of its federal debt, the consequences would be catastrophic. Trillions in safe assets would vanish from the balance sheets of banks and funds around the world. The dollar supply would contract violently. The global financial machine which uses treasuries as the lubricant for almost everything, would seize. The world doesn't actually want its governments to get to zero. It wants them to stay just safe enough, just credible enough, just stable enough that the IOUs they issue keep functioning as money-like assets. That's why, when politicians talk about paying down the national debt as if it is a household credit card, they're selling you a fairy tale. The real objective isn't elimination, it's choreography, keeping the pile large, rolling, and believable. The trouble starts when belief wavers. You've seen what happens at the edges. In Greece in 2010, the story of sustainable debt snapped. Years of hidden deficits and creative accounting collided with the hard arithmetic of bond markets. Investors panicked. Yields on Greek government bonds spiked. Suddenly, refinancing wasn't automatic. It was a battle for survival. The European Central Bank and the IMF stepped in with rescue packages. But the lifeline came tied to austerity. Tax hikes, spending cuts, mass unemployment, privatization. For an entire generation, bailout meant wages slashed, pensions reduced, and public services gutted, all to restore confidence in numbers on a screen. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned sovereign debt into a recurring national trauma. Each cycle brings new agreements, new restructurings, new promises. The creditors change. The faces in government change. The underlying dynamic doesn't. When confidence breaks, the social cost is paid on the streets. In Sri Lanka, when foreign currency reserves dried up and the government couldn't service its loans, the crisis wasn't abstract. It showed up as fuel shortages, food lines, blackouts, protests, and the collapse of a government. These aren't random tragedies. They retest cases in what happens when a country loses access to the rolling mechanism that richer nations take for granted. Notice something in each story. Once the music stops, the creditors suddenly become visible. You hear the names, the IMF, the rating agencies, the bondholders. But they were there all along. The crisis just pulled away the curtain. In the core economies, the same logic operates in a more subtle form. The United States rolls its $38 trillion. Japan rolls debt amounting to more than 250% of its GDP. The European Union rolls trillions of euros. As long as central banks provide backstops and investors believe the game will continue, yields stay manageable and the illusion of infinite rollover holds. You are living inside that illusion. Every 12 months, your government has to issue new debt just to pay off old debt and fund current spending. Before a single teacher is paid, a single road is built, or a single social program is funded, the bond market must be fed. Interest must be served. When interest costs start to rival defense, healthcare, or social security, the situation ceases to be an academic debate. It becomes survival math. Tax more, and you risk revolt or capital flight. Cut spending, and you risk political collapse. Let inflation run, and you quietly rob savers. That's why, in practice, the path of least resistance is always some blend of three things. Roll the debt, manage the narrative, and let inflation do part of the dirty work. For decades, this has been the pattern. Interest rates pressed near zero for years. Central banks buying bonds by the trillion under labels like quantitative easing, subtle changes to how inflation is measured, all of it presented as technocratic tuning, none of it neutral. Every basis point is a political choice about who wins and who loses. Because when a government pays interest, it doesn't pay it from a magic pot. It pays it from taxes, from borrowing more, or from letting the currency drift. And those choices determine who, in the end, funds the system. You've probably heard the soothing phrase, "We owe it to ourselves." It's meant to comfort you. Don't worry about the national debt. The country collectively is both debtor and creditor. There's a narrow truth there, but it skips the most important detail. Ourselves is not a flat group. Interest flows in a specific direction, from taxpayers, consumers, and workers toward the institutions and individuals who hold the debt as an asset. From the many who pay into the system to the few who sit on top of it. From the person trying to keep up with rent to the fund collecting coupons on government bonds. Debt isn't just a transfer between countries, it's a transfer between classes. Global indebtedness and global inequality rise together for a reason. The system rewards those who own claims on future cash flows and punishes those who simply supply the cash. And you're not standing outside of this system watching it from a distance. You are woven into it. Your taxes help fund interest. Your pension depends on bond yields. Your savings are denominated in currencies born from debt. Your job security is tied to governments maintaining market confidence. The machine isn't somewhere else. It is under your feet. At this point, it's tempting to look for a villain, to imagine a single mastermind at the top of the pyramid. Maybe it's China. Maybe it's Wall Street. Maybe it's the IMF. But that's part of the illusion too. There is no single face at the apex of this structure. There's a network, governments that issue debt, central banks that sanctify it, banks and funds that trade it, households that depend on it for their deposits and pensions. You're not outside the game. You are one of its moving parts. The modern financial system has turned debt itself into money. Governments issue bonds. Banks use those bonds as collateral to create more credit. Investors treat them as near cash. Central banks accept them in exchange for newly created reserves. The line between money and IOU blurs until, practically speaking, they are the same thing. Once you see that, the usual story, if we're all in debt, someone out there must be the creditor, stops making sense. The world is both creditor and debtor to itself. But that doesn't mean everyone is equally protected when something goes wrong. When confidence is high, the system feels stable. Debt rolls, interest gets paid, markets hum, politicians talk about fiscal responsibility while quietly adding more obligations. As long as everyone believes the promises will be refinanced, not repaid, the numbers can grow without triggering immediate panic. But confidence is not permanent. It's a mood, and moods change. So what happens if the world starts to doubt its own promises? You've already seen fragments of the answer in crisis countries. The stakes in core economies are even higher. If investors ever genuinely question the ability or willingness of major governments to keep rolling their debts smoothly, the feedback loop can turn vicious fast. Yields spike. Refinancing costs explode. Central banks are forced into even more extreme measures. In that kind of stress, the abstract question, who is the creditor, suddenly becomes personal. Because the adjustment doesn't land on an empty field. It lands on you. It lands on your cost of living when inflation is used as the safety valve. It lands on your job when austerity cuts spending. It lands on your savings when currency devaluation quietly shaves purchasing power off every unit you own. The system's first goal is its own survival, and survival, historically, means preserving the web of claims at the top, even if that means sacrificing the security of those at the middle and bottom. That's the real answer to the paradox. If every country is in debt, and if debt has become the operating system of the world, then the someone who is owed is not a single villain in a tower. It's a structure, a hierarchy of holders, a network of institutions that treat your government's IOUs as their safest asset and your future tax payments as their most reliable cash flow. Debt once meant bondage for individuals, chains, prison, servitude. Today, at the sovereign level, it means balance. It means a delicate, constantly managed equilibrium between promises and belief. As long as that balance holds, your world works. You get paid, you buy things, you invest, you vote. You live inside an economy where the numbers stretch into the trillions and yet daily life feels normal. But underneath that normality sits a sentence nobody in power will say out loud. The plan was never to pay it all back. The plan is to keep you believing it will be. That belief is what allows governments to roll debt forever. It's what allows markets to treat IOUs as money. It is what allows central banks to create new reserves by buying bonds and calling it policy rather than desperation. If that belief holds, the game continues. Numbers get bigger, graphics get scarier, commentators argue about deficits, but your world remains mostly functional. If that belief breaks, you find out what debt really is. Not a harmless abstraction, not a number on a screen, a promise. And like all promises, it cannot be rolled over forever without consequence. The question isn't whether the system will try to keep going. It will. The question, for you, is where you choose to stand inside it. Do you live as if the promises at the top are sacred, unbreakable, guaranteed? Or do you treat them for what history shows them to be? Contingent, renegotiable, sometimes sacrificed to save the structure that issued them. If this story shifts the way you see the red numbers on the debt clock, good. It's supposed to. Because once you understand that the world doesn't just owe it to itself, you can stop asking, who is the creditor, in the abstract, and start asking the real question. When the bill comes due, not in principle, but in confidence, in inflation, in adjustment, who exactly is going to pay?